A warm welcome to you, our viewers. I am Nicole Walker, Director of Programs at CAPRI, a think tank keen on evidence-informed research on topics relevant to Jamaica's development, with a view to improved public policy making in Jamaica and the wider Caribbean. Despite several unanticipated challenges during the research process, we are pleased tonight to present the findings of our research and to launch the report, Fair Pay, the Wage Gap Barrier to Women's Empowerment. This study, the third in a three-part series of studies on the care economy, examines the gender wage gap in Jamaica with reference to its intersection with the care economy, the sector responsible for the provision of services related to nurturing and reproduction of the population. This and the other reports were carried out with the support of the EU under the project Civil Society Organizations as Actors of Governance and Development, which commenced in June 2019 and ends this month. The actionable policy recommendations are in line with one of the project's key specific objectives, which is to promote women's empowerment. Dr. Kelly Ann Dixon-Hamill, the lead researcher, will present the findings and recommendations. I heard Dr. Dixon-Hamill do a practice run, and I can assure you that her presentation will be both insightful and thought-provoking. A panel discussion will follow with her and Ronaldo Blake, research assistant on this study. Dr. Diana Thorburn, Director of Research, will moderate the conversation. We are particularly proud of this and our other two reports on the care economy, as these are the first empirical studies on this important topic in Jamaica and the English-speaking Caribbean. The reports were a joint effort by the CAPRI team, including Ronaldo, Diana, Yentel Williams, our Director of Strategy, Priya Alexander, our Economics Researcher, and Shanna K. Chisholm, Staff Researcher. We encourage you to participate in the discussion by submitting questions online using Slido. To do so, visit slido.com and enter the event code CAPRI, after which you will have the option to post or upvote questions you deem crucial for our panelists to respond to. Let's welcome Anicito Rodriguez Ruiz, the Head of Cooperation for the EU delegation, who will give greetings.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the European Union, I welcome you to this web forum to hear and discuss issues related to the gender wage gap in Jamaica and its intersection with the care economy. By launching this report, Pay Fair, the gender wage gap as a barrier to women's empowerment, CAPRI has satisfactorily completed the implementation of the project Civil Society Organizations as Actors of Governance and Development, co-funded by the European Union. During the last 3 years, this project has succeeded in placing very relevant and burning issues for Jamaican society in the public debate and has provided all of us a good compass to navigate the data and the arguments related to them. It has been a very interesting journey around evidences and policy implications, opportunities and barriers, possible solutions and innovations for the empowerment and inclusion of vulnerable youth and women. However, even as the project is finalizing, our journey doesn't finish here. Not only we wish to continue EU partnership with CAPRI and all like-minded civil society organizations, but it is now the time to intensify the dialogue and advocacy initiatives with all stakeholders and duty bearers that, based on data and the recommendations identified, can produce the necessary policy shifts and implement the initiatives to address the most urgent needs. Civil society, private sector organizations, the academia and research centers like CAPRI have an important role to play. By stimulating public debate and giving voice to the concerns of vulnerable people, they can contribute to good governance, better economic inclusion, and accelerate progress on gender equality and women and youth empowerment. In Europe, We are also having very similar debates to the ones that are taking place in Jamaica. Gender wage gap and care economy are among them. Closing these gaps is a priority for the European Union, and the European Union has put in place several initiatives urging member states to invest to remove the existing barriers. Therefore, we are very satisfied that today, as in previous occasions, we are having this conversation here in Jamaica and that the European Union has contributed to make them possible. Therefore, I wish you a very frank and productive dialogue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aniceto, and welcome again to all of our viewers. Welcome to Dr. Kellyanne Dixon, statistician, lecturer in economics at the University of the West Indies and senior research fellow at CAPRI, and the lead researcher, and Ronaldo Blake, research assistant, who was invaluable on this and the previous Care Economy report. What Aniceto did not mention is that these three studies, and it's the first time that CAPRI has done a three-part series of studies, emerged out of a study that we did back in 2018, also on the care economy. That was the very first study ever done on the care economy in Jamaica and the English-speaking Caribbean. It was what's called an indicative study, which is scoping out the field. And so many questions emerged out of that research. We then got the opportunity to pursue those questions in these three studies that we have been sharing, the third of which we'll share tonight. I just want to do a quick recap of the first two so we can get an idea of where we're coming from, and then we'll get into the presentation for this one. So if we can just play the highlights of the first two studies, please.
Let's start by defining the care economy. The care economy is that sector of the economy that is responsible for providing services that contribute to nurturing and reproducing current and future populations. Globally, 42% of women and 6% of men cannot get jobs because they have care responsibilities. Evidence shows that when employers support workers with care duties, business and personal outcomes improve. The gender division of labor, or how work is traditionally distributed between men and women, means that women spend twice as much time in unpaid work than men do. In 2020, 15,700 Jamaican women were out of the labor force to stay with dependents, while the number for men was negligible. It is well established that the most effective way to support women to participate in formal labor markets is by providing access to reliable, affordable, and high-quality childcare services. This report marks a seminal moment in our understanding of the Jamaican care economy, as it is the first comprehensive monetary estimate of unpaid domestic and care work.
This project aims to improve governance and accountability by stimulating policy innovation and enhancing policy responsiveness in the areas of women's empowerment, your advocacy, and economic inclusion.
Its value will be more than the combined value of agriculture, manufacturing, mining, construction, and utilities. That such a large share of economic activities unpaid is a problem.
Those who engage in paid work and have to come and engage themselves in unpaid care and domestic work, it is a double burden for them.
Thank you. So we started out by measuring the care economy, which, if you've heard me talk, I can't quite stop talking about because it's such an innovative and almost revolutionary way of thinking about the care economy, which has never been done before, with the data set from Statin, from the Survey of Living Conditions. We first started by measuring it, and then we looked at what the implications are of that value. And this evening, we're going to look further at the implications of the value of unpaid care work, specifically how it impacts on one of the most pernicious problems with gender equality and women's empowerment, which is a gender wage gap. And I'm going to hand over to Kelly, our lead researcher, to give us a presentation of the report.
In Jamaica, for every $100 that men earn, women only earn $61. The per capita income for men in Jamaica is $11,044 US, while the per capita income for Jamaican women is only $6,729 US. This report, Fair Pay, examines the gender wage gap and how it intersects with the division of labor of unpaid care and domestic work. The gender wage gap is defined as a disparity between men and women's income. Related to this is also the unexplained gender wage gap, which is the gap between what women and men earn after accounting for factors such as education, experience, age, and industry. Wage gaps that are narrow, meaning closer to 100, are preferred, as it means women are closer to being on equal footing with men in terms of income earned. The calculation of the wage gap can be tricky, and numerous methods have been used. For the Jamaica, the estimates have ranged from the widest gap being 61% to the smallest gap of 88%. Given this disparity in measures, we are using the Global Gender Gap Index measurement since it is the international benchmark and is usually cited. While it is known that women often earn lower wages than men for the same or similar types of jobs in Jamaica, it is believed that this difference is associated with the glass ceiling, which is a barrier that women face when trying to advance in an organization, and the glass escalator, where men are put on a fast track to advance to higher positions in a company or organization. The gender wage gap in Jamaica is highest among the poor, less among the university and college educated, and is not found in the public sector. In a survey of tertiary graduates in Jamaica, just a quarter of the respondents believed that in the last 5 years, they had been paid less than someone of the opposite sex for similar work by the same employer. Interestingly, 88% of those who believed this were women. Furthermore, 40% of the respondents knew someone other than themselves who seemed to have been paid less than someone of the opposite sex for similar work by the same employer. In almost 9 out of 10 cases, the sex of the worker who was paid less was female. The survey also showed that men experience greater returns on their investment in education than women. When asked whether they believed their degree helped them to get a good job with a good salary, nearly 2/3 of men agreed with the statement, compared to only half of the women in the survey. Additionally, 65% believed that their tertiary education was good value for money. This sentiment was only shared by 46% of the women surveyed. In 2013, the International Labour Organization identified 15 barriers to women having leadership positions in Jamaica. Of those that relate to how work is traditionally and usually distributed between men and women, one speaks specifically to the fact that women have more family responsibilities than men. Actually, women don't just have greater family responsibilities. They spend more than twice the amount of time in unpaid care and domestic work than men do. A Caribbean-wide study found that women's unemployment was much higher than men's because employers preferred male workers. It is believed that this occurs because women's child care responsibilities cause a higher rate of absenteeism. Unpaid care and domestic work, therefore, is a big driver of the gender wage gap. When women are making choices about work, nearly 60% of them feel constrained by their familial duties. In contrast, no men reported such constraints. Additionally, as reported in our previous study, women spend 4 hours per day doing unpaid work and 3 hours per day doing paid work. Men, on the other hand, spend less than 2 hours per day doing unpaid work and 4.5 hours doing paid work. Furthermore, the presence of children in the home is linked to lower earnings for women, but not for men. Also, after having children, men's income tends to rise while women tend to lose income. Therefore, based on this information about unpaid work, we can conclude that men are given more opportunities to earn. Since the gender wage gap is known to exist in Jamaica, efforts have been made from a legislative and policy perspective to correct this. The first is the Equal Pay Act of 1975, which, as the name suggests, provides for the payment of equal work for equal pay between male and female employees in the same establishment. There is also the Maternity Leave Act of 1979, which allows for maternity pay for employees who qualify for maternity leave. And finally, there's the 2011 National Policy on Gender Equality, which has committed to reviewing the Equal Pay Act, among other things. Although these legislation and policy are in place, the International Labour Organization has found little action to correct the gender wage gap. This finding is not unique to Jamaica. When reviewing the legislation, the fine for breaching the Equal Pay Act is a fine not exceeding $200 or imprisonment with or without hard labor for a term not exceeding 12 months. This is equivalent to the cost of a bottle of water. If after conviction, if the offense is continued, there is an additional fine not exceeding $20 per day. In 2019, a Jamaican gender rights advocate stated, "I sense that it's just not on the agenda for our lawmakers. The equal pay law really has no policy directive, and I really don't know of any one ministry with responsibility for it. The law, while conceptually strong, has lacked teeth and power in preventing discrimination against women, even if they performed at equal standards to their male counterparts. While our current legislation and policy have not achieved their objectives, there are other options that are suitable for Jamaica that have had measurable and desirable outcomes in other countries. The first is support for unpaid care obligations. Since the unequal share of care responsibilities limits women's job prospects and is a major reason behind the gender wage gap, employer-provided and state support for employees with care obligations would facilitate more time for paid productive work. In more advanced economies, this is the form of child care subsidies and paid parental leave. While in developing economies, investments that reduce the time women spend on household production have been successful. Secondly, pay transparency has also been effective in awareness about the gender wage gap and giving employees information they need to challenge pay disparities. Pay transparency has been legislated in many cases. Of note, however, what appears to be more effective in closing the pay gap is voluntary disclosure of pay information by companies. What is key with pay transparency, if legislation is used, is that it must be crafted to balance the goal of pay transparency and the need to protect the privacy rights and interests of employees and employers. Now let us consider our policy options. When pay transparency is legislated, it may take different forms. In countries such as the UK, Canada, and Germany, by law, companies over a certain size are required to disclose the average pay for different jobs within the company, or upon request, make pay information publicly available. It may also require companies to report their pay gaps. Also, like in Peru, it may require companies to keep tables detailing employee categories, their function, and pay. The first step to acceptability and adoption of pay transparency in Jamaica would be implementation in the public sector. Although there is no wage gap in the public sector, this initiative would establish a precedent for employers to follow. It would also contribute to good governance and public trust. We recommend that the Ministry of Finance establishes an online database that publicly displays the salaries of public sector posts. This website should be easy to access, user-friendly, and the data updated regularly. This policy should also be actively communicated and promoted to increase public awareness and access to the information. Secondly, it is recommended that publicly listed companies be required to make known their salary scales and that this be included in the Jamaica Stock Exchange Governance Index. Currently, the Governance Index includes environmental considerations based on the Global Gender Gap Composite Index, which includes income. Women have achieved 75% parity with men. But given that the wage gap is 61%, it suggests that despite women having near parity with men in education, health, and political leadership, they are being pulled down to 75 because of this large gender wage gap. As we have shown, the gender wage gap is related to unpaid care and domestic work, which is mainly done by women. This places constraints on their market participation, career advancement, and productivity. The gender wage gap is an economic loss that is borne by the entire society as it hinders productivity and economic growth. A reduction in women's unpaid care work would not only increase gender equality, but also reduce income inequality and would result in better outcomes for children. The provision of transparency about how much employees are paid is an area in which policy change can yield an improvement in the gender wage gap and is therefore another option that can be used to address this issue in Jamaica.
Thank you, Kelly. I have to admit that my heart is quite full. This has been, we've been 3 years in this project, and these 3 studies, we put a lot of work into them. Before I go into more of the discussion, some housekeeping, Slido, slido.com, event code CAPRI, and there's a poll there that we'd like you to answer. We'll share the results later, asking if you know anyone any woman who has earned less than men in the same job position. And then also you can post questions, and that's what's on my iPad here, is the questions, and you can vote them up. I already see one, and it's actually quite a good question. So send the questions in, and I will pose them to Ronaldo and Kelly. So my heart is full because, you know, as I said, we put a lot of work into this study. We put a lot of work into the entire project, but this study in particular was challenging. And I'm going to ask Kelly to explain some of the challenges, but just to say that, you know, we often have in our social media, on one of our hashtags is "we go where the data takes us." And this was a study where we went where we had to go. We had no choice but to go where the data took us. It's kind of behind the scenes, but I think it's worth sharing with those who are interested. And it's also worth sharing just in terms of understanding how evidence is translated into policy, which is tell us why we had to go where the data took us for this particular study.
Yes, so one of our aims at the very beginning was to actually calculate the gender wage gap. The issue with that, however, and we noted that as we were collecting data, is that there were persons who, or respondents, were not willing to share information on their income and expenditure so that we could use that to calculate the gender wage gap. As was mentioned in the presentation, the calculation is very tricky, and we have to get accurate information to be able to truly know what that wage gap is. So we had to change course, as it were, because we were not getting the reliable data and enough of the data to be able to calculate that wage gap.
Why is it that people are reluctant to share? Because there's an anonymous survey.
Yes.
What is it about this? Is this something unique to Jamaica?
So no, this isn't unique to Jamaica. It's not unique to this survey either. It is that many persons are hesitant in sharing their income. It is a worldwide issue. A number of times it's distrust of the survey company. It is the feeling that their information may be then sent back to the government, retaxation. In some instances, it may be just not wanting to share because they feel they may be judged. And so with all those issues, it does become challenging to collect information on income.
And one of the few questions that we were able to get an answer to was for people who had witnessed or experienced a gender wage gap. There was a very high percentage who did not talk about it, report it, or try to do anything about it.
Yes, so over 90% of those in our sample, and our sample size was about just a little over 700. For those who stated that they experienced this, what was done? Nothing. Did this differ between males and females? It did not. So once it's identified, neither men nor women are doing anything to rectify it.
Yeah, these are some of the unanticipated challenges that Nicole mentioned. Ronaldo, you've been working with us on this very intensively, and there was another way in which we had to go where the data took us, because the original intention of this study was to try and correlate migration to the gender wage gap. Tell us about how we had to change course a few times in getting to where we got, which I'm very happy about. Let me just say, I think that we did actually come to some really solid conclusions with some very innovative policy recommendations. But tell us about where we had attempted to go in the first place.
Yeah, so one of the other things that we tried to look at was how tertiary education, migration, and the gender wage gap intersected. Because what we have is a case in most countries now where women are overrepresented in tertiary education. So we wanted to see if there were any relationships between migration out of Jamaica, particularly of highly educated women, and the high gender wage gap that holds in Jamaica. And of course, a part of the thing that would motivate people to migrate in the first place is the difference in wages between Jamaica and overseas. But unfortunately, we weren't seeing a lot of connections between care work or the gender wage gap locally or overseas and how that related to migration. So we focused more now on what was going on locally.
Yeah, there were just so many confounding variables that came up that at the outset we hadn't realized would come up, again, going where the data leads us. But before we go into the report, there was some really interesting findings from the migration questions, Kelly, that I just want to share, because we're not going to get another chance to share them unless we do a migration study at some point. But yeah, just share with our audience some of those just interesting tidbits that came up.
Right. So just to also reiterate what Ronaldo said, this study was of tertiary graduates. And so this would be the group that we're referring to. So just to begin with, the majority of the sample, almost 60%, had wanted to migrate, but they had not yet started the formal process. 29% of the samples, and then almost 30%, had wanted to migrate and had started the formal process. And then there was that 12% that they were comfortable staying in Jamaica. When we looked at those who were interested in migrating, 73% of females had wanted to migrate, whether they had started the process or not. 73% of females compared to 63% of males. That's a significant difference there. Also, almost 3/4 of those who were raised by someone other than a biological parent, and those raised by single parents, about 3/4 had wanted to migrate. This is in comparison to those who were raised by both biological parents. That percentage of those wanting to migrate was a lot lower. Yes.
Yeah, that jumped out at me when I was reading the survey results, and of course that could have taken us down a rabbit hole of why this is so. Definitely a question for future research, or for anybody else out there who is interested in migration studies. We share all of our data. We're happy to share the data set with anyone who's interested, but that finding supports our general 85% number, because 88% wanted to or had already started planning to migrate, and the commonly thrown around figure of tertiary graduates who migrate is 85%. And then to know that most of those are women, and then again that you're more likely to not want to migrate if you grew up in a two-parent household, biological family household. Very interesting. Okay, so I've kind of gone off into the interesting stuff that we couldn't get into the report, but let's get into the report itself. And we already have some questions. And I'm going to put this one to you, Ronaldo, because I think this is one of the refrains that come up a lot when we talk about the gender wage gap and gender equality in Jamaica. Since Jamaica has the highest number of female managers globally, wouldn't this suggest that men are at a disadvantage in the workplace, and don't women earn more? We address that in the report. So please share with why this is not so.
So the first thing to note is that calculating the gender wage gap is a very complicated process. But when you have enough data, you're able to get a good representation of what's going on. Now, as we said before, women are actually overrepresented in tertiary education. So it does follow that women also are very well represented in terms of leadership in the country. But what we tend to find in many instances is women occupy high mid-level managerial positions and high-level managerial positions, but men take on leadership roles. And even within those positions that women occupy, you could see women getting paid less than men. And of course, the reasons for that would be generally multiple, but one of them certainly is the care work and the unpaid domestic work that women do have to do. It subtracts from the time that they're able to dedicate to work. It subtracts from the amount of experience they're able to get. So it does have longer term implications, and you really do have to unpack data like that from what you see just on the face value and try to get an understanding of what's happening beneath.
And I remember once we had a meeting in the Dean's conference room, and they had all the photographs of the previous deans of the Faculty of Social Sciences, and they were all men. And I thought, well, the majority of women as students, I don't know what the lecturer ratio is, but just from my eyeballing it, it looks like it's mostly women. But all men who have been deans. And I said it to Damien, I said, there's not a woman up there. And he said, but would a woman even want that job? And I think it goes back to, and I thought about it, I thought, I wouldn't want that job. I wouldn't be able to manage that job and everything else that goes with it. So I think the point is that, yes, there is women in management. I think we have the highest proportion of women managers in the world. But if you look above that, that's when you start to see the disparity, and that's really where the disparity kind of matters more in terms of income generation, wealth, earnings, and so on.
I think I also want to add to that, the majority of women stated that they took into consideration their constraints when they were looking for work. And no men said they ever did that. So I think that also speaks to why we're not seeing women in those high leadership positions.
And if I just could add a final point to it, a majority of people in Jamaica are not working in corporate spaces, you know? So you have a lot of people who are just on the streets doing service work, doing trades work. And when you look at where women and men are working and what the earning is, that actually contributes a lot to the gender wage gap. And sometimes it can even be more impactful. So it's like poverty and people's quality of life and so on. So.
Yeah, so basically the take home to that answer to that is that yes, we have the highest number of female managers globally, but don't watch that.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, I'm gonna have the poll results of the first poll asking people's experiences with if they know of anyone who's had the gender wage gap. Can we get those results, please? Okay, interesting. Similar to our survey. Yeah, it's always good when we can get confirmation from another data source, right? Okay, we're going to go to a second poll, which I'll announce later. But please go back to Slido for the second poll and also keep sending in your questions. I mean, we kind of touched on this, Kelly, but I think, you know, just having it supporting the answer to this question with the data might be helpful. Do the findings from this report indicate that as a woman, I may be getting paid less than my male colleagues? And is this something I should take up with my boss?
Well, given that, so let's put it in perspective. A quarter of the sample, just about 190 persons out of the 710, said that in the last 5 years, they felt they were being paid less than someone of the opposite sex for the same work by the same employer. Of that group, 88% were women. So in this case, there is, given that you're a woman, there is a probability that yes, you may be being paid less. Should you take it up with your boss? That's for you to decide. However, I think when we get into the report and we look at the solutions, this is where pay transparency comes into play. Because if it is that we know whether it is the average pay for that position, or we have additional details, then when and if you decide to take it off with your boss, you have the evidence. And I think the evidence will speak more. And it has been shown that when we have pay transparency, it is known to reduce that gap.
Okay, another question here. I don't think we fully addressed this, so it's a kind of a curveball at you, Ronaldo. Would a gender quota help to reduce the gender wage gap? Is part one. And are there any instances of men being paid less because of their gender? Again, these are not things we directly looked at in the study, but I think we could make some inferences.
So I think a gender quota is a tricky issue. It might be helpful, but again, if we look at what currently holds, it may not be the most effective thing at closing the wage gap, because we do have women who are in positions of power. And if the dynamic still exists where they're not able to fully participate in the workforce, then the same kinds of forces that are currently at play will also act in a world where we do have a gender quota. Another thing that we have to consider is that a large part of the gender wage gap besides the unpaid care and domestic work that women disproportionately do, has to do with the kinds of occupations that women do predominantly, which are service occupations, while men tend to specialize more in trades. Even among women who are highly educated, there tends to be a focus on social work, so education, healthcare, while men tend to focus on things that are more science and technology. We see that changing now, but of course, the dynamic still kind of holds. So I think a quota might be helpful, but we do have to look at those more important underlying factors that determine wage rates and so on. Can you repeat the second part of the question for me?
Are there any instances of men being paid? Well, actually, we did. The data did speak to that, Kelly. What did the data say about instances of men being paid less because of their gender?
So just over 12% of those who had experienced it were men. Okay. So it is happening.
Or it's perceived
to be happening.
Right.
Yes, correct. It's perceived to be happening. We were not able to get information on which industry or which sector to determine if this was in a concentrated area or if it's just across the board.
Yeah, I mean, from the difficulties that we had with collecting some of this data, it made me think that it would really require more of an anthropological, methodological approach to try and really get the trust of people to share, but that would be extremely intensive, intensive field work. All right, another question, and this I thought was interesting as well. We said that we didn't, the research shows that there is not a wage gap in the public sector. And the question here is, does it suggest the public sector is more productive? I doubt that. But how would we explain that? How might we explain that we didn't find a gender wage gap in the public sector? At least we didn't cover that, but in the secondary data that we looked at, it was shown quite definitively that there wasn't a gender wage gap in the public sector.
Yes, and I believe actually that may not just be unique to Jamaica, and that's possibly because the public sector has their specific scales. So you fall within these scales. So it's difficult to necessarily use some sort of difference or bias to give one gender a higher wage than another. So does it mean that the public sector is more productive? I'm not sure about that. Given that, yes, we know that when we reduce the wage gap, it does increase productivity. However, there are other factors that will also determine what productivity, what levels of productivity.
Well, I can say from the second study that we did, which looked at productivity specifically with regard to care work, one of the things that jumped out at us was that in Jamaica, the data shows, not data that we've done, but others have done, that the public sector is the least productive sector in Jamaica. So I think the answer to that is no. But I think it brings up the interesting question, because in a way there's kind of de facto pay transparency in the public sector. So we made this recommendation that it should be public. So, and the question did come up, but it's already public. Why did we push this as such a strong recommendation, Ronaldo, for the public sector to be the leader in pay transparency when it pretty much already exists?
So first it's public, but who knows, right? Like if you ask the average person on the street, what does X person in government work, they likely wouldn't be able to tell you. And even if you do go online and try to figure that out, it's difficult for you to actually unravel all of that information. One of the other things that came up in our extensive discussions with stakeholders was that the information is there, but it's extremely complicated. And a part of that has to do with the wage structure that we're currently phasing out of government. So now we do have a new structure coming in, but this information is highly technical, and it's not likely that the average Joe or Jane who is just like going through a normal non-economic job is going to be able to access this information and make sense of it. So the reason why it's important to have this kind of data in a centralized basis that's very easy to understand is that it could actually serve its purpose of empowering people. So if you're in a job in the private sector, you could look at what someone in the public sector earns and you could make a comparison. Or if you're in the public sector, of course, you could easily access that information. So the data is there, but it's very important for it to be accessible and transparent.
Interesting. And also, as we mentioned, in keeping with just principles of good governance and transparency, which are things that we've pushed in other work we've done with the budget and so on. All right, another question here. And this one's interesting. So how does this study take into account that more women take on care jobs, which with less pay, whereas more men take on higher paying jobs? I think we're speaking to occupational segregation and why that's significant in understanding the gender wage gap. I'm going to give that one to you, Ronaldo, because I know you spent a lot of time on that.
Right. So a large part of it is cultural, right? Many of the things that we're trying to research, we just simply can't make sense of it, because if you just look at numbers and digits and you try to do statistics, it doesn't make any sense. So a part of it is women are acculturized from early to pursue particular career paths. They're told from early that they should focus on building a family, taking care of a husband. And once that conditioning comes in, people do kind of build into their mindset that, they should essentially take on jobs and follow career paths that will allow them to strike a better balance between their paid work and their unpaid work. It's kind of like Kelly said earlier, when men are thinking about moving up the career ladder, they don't think, how is this going to impact my child that I have to pick up from school? But women do consider those things, so while a large part of it is like stuff that you could look at and try to figure out, part of it is actually cultural, what careers people go into. So once we have more transparency and once we kind of open up options to women and men, then that will help to get us to a place where it's a bit more equitable.
I'm giving you this one, Kelly. You're probably going to vex with me after. But it says, persons would argue that equal pay for equal work is a fantasy because not all women can do the same jobs as men. How can you convince them that it's not a fantasy?
Well, if it's equal pay for equal work, then it suggests that they're the same.
Yeah.
So it is not a fantasy. And actually, in some cases, what we've found, especially with the voluntary pay transparency, that the difference between what men and women earn, that gap is very small. So you're looking at, let's say, women earning $1 and men will be earning $1.01. So it reduces that gap. And that's what we're interested in doing, reducing the gap. Because it's important to remember that when we have that reduction in the gap, there's increased productivity. And therefore, that not just helps from the perspective of an individual or an individual company, that then has a national effect. And so that snowball effect happens. Also, there's an impact on poverty. So the income inequality is reduced when we know that we reduce the gender wage gap. So it's not a fantasy, because in some cases, $1 and $1.01, let's call that equal. There's no significant difference there, and it has occurred. So then why not strive towards it?
Pay transparency, Ronaldo. This is, when we brought up with the stakeholders, there were, Why did we go down that road, and how far did we go?
So we went as far as considering whether legislating mandatory pay transparency for companies of a certain size in Jamaica would be something that was feasible to do and would be an effective way of reducing the gender wage gap. What we have seen in other countries, Canada, the European Union, the United States, is a significant uptake of pay transparency laws, because there has been a recognition that equal pay laws are just simply not enough. Even countries like Peru in the global south, So when we brought it up, it wasn't well received, partially because there were concerns about safety and also concerns about non-compliance. But what we realized is that it has actually been effective to some extent in many countries in reducing the wage gap, and it's recognized as something that will really accrue benefits over the long run. So it's not something that will necessarily immediately come into place. But I think what we need to emphasize now, even if we don't go ahead with legislation, is that having pay transparency is a good thing, because sometimes the private sector companies don't even realize that they're doing a bad job at setting wages because they don't have a pay scale. When you don't have a pay scale, you just get someone coming in and you pull a wage out of thin air, sometimes by asking a salary history, sometimes by looking at a competitor or a peer in the industry. So the pay transparency actually helps you to first identify the kind of job that you're offering, the criteria that the person needs to have, and it gives you a more objective basis on which to set a pay. So the point we're at now is, how do we use this tool that we don't necessarily have to legislate now, but can be important in reducing the gender pay gap? And different countries have implemented it in different ways. It's not always fully public. Sometimes data is anonymized and it's sent to the government. And then once there's a gap, there can be actions between the government and the company to try to correct that.
I think I also want to add that even though we're not fully sure what happened at the beginning when these countries started collecting this information and publishing this information, that I'm sure the apprehension was pretty much the same. However, over time, it has just become very normal. So in some states, everyone who is a public sector worker, whether it is in main government or let's say you are working at a government university, your name can be typed in and your actual wages are available for as many years as you request. And in those states, as I know, it's, oh, okay, it's nothing new. Yeah, it's there. However, I'm sure at the very beginning, there was a lot of apprehension.
Yeah, so hence our kind of proposal to kind of ease it in. And I think also there was an also very significant finding that I found surprising, that voluntary pay transparency is more effective.
Yes.
So legislating it might actually not even be the best way to go, and certainly not at the outset, but introducing it kind of more softly and gently, and having it part of the governance index of publicly listed companies is probably a good way to go, not only because they have already considered environment and it's something that is more easily regulated, but also because this is a trend with ESG, environmental, social governance, gender equality, gender wage gap, care economy are issues that fit squarely in the ESG agenda. We have a few minutes left, and I want to come back to where we started with all of this, back from 2018 with this indicative study that we did and the data that we got. And I'm going to ask you from a data perspective first, Kelly. This data that we have on time use and what it has opened up to us, how far can we go with this? We've seen in Jamaica that, maybe because we haven't had the data before, that the care economy is still not something that people have really grasped. There's a tendency to confuse it with domestic work, paid domestic work, and there isn't great clarity, and it's not used as a frame for understanding many of these issues, and there's so many adjacent issues to it. So just from as a statistician, having this data, where can we go with it going forward? Considering what has been done, we've only just begun with it, obviously.
Right.
Where can we go?
So I think one of the things that we would want to do is to continue to collect this data, because especially when you start having data over a time period, a time series, you're able to see how that changes. And I believe once the data is available, understanding once the data is being used will also come with that. So more data, as long as we have more researchers using the data and publishing the results, in understandable forms, then I think that will also change the view of what the care economy actually is. So it gives a better understanding of what it is, and we also know where we are with it.
And to you, kind of have the last word here, Ronaldo. We've looked at, first we valued it, and the value is phenomenal. I don't think it's really sunk in yet what that means, the value of it. And we have, we've started to explore what that value might mean for employers to try and get something of that value by investing in support for their workers. And we've now looked at the gender wage gap. What else is there for policy to consider? What other types of policy innovations can we begin to think about with the data and the care economy and a better understanding of the care economy?
I think once we start to better understand the burden of unpaid care and domestic work and where it falls, we should be trying to figure out how well we can integrate this into a normal functioning economy. Because one of the huge problems that we're having now is we tend to segregate it as one being more personal work that cannot be commercialized, and the other being stuff that is only in the domain of private sector enterprise and their employees. So I think we need to try to figure out how we can integrate the two. But a part of that as well is we don't want to over-commercialize it. Right? We don't want it to just all be about, okay, how do we get kids into institutions so their parents could go out and work? So it's about striking a balance between your unpaid work and your paid work, and improving lives and livelihoods while also improving the economy and the lives of women who unfortunately hold most of the burden of unpaid care and domestic work now.
Yeah, I think one of the instructive comments, I think it was in the first study from reviewers, said to Yentel and myself, so is it that care work is a bad thing?
Right.
And I think that's kind of the line that you have to draw and the balance you have to achieve. Of course, it's not. That's what keeps our societies going. People who have children love to look after their children. Well, most of us have our children. And yeah, how do you, and I suppose that's the role of data and data-informed policies. How do you strike the balance where you can maximize gains as well as retaining our humanity? One of the late questions that came in here was about if in Cuba, if we just paid everybody the same thing, regardless of what they do, would that erase it? But no, that's not, I don't think that would be a very good solution either. But I want to thank you so much for this rich discussion. I'm sure we're going to continue talking about it afterwards. This has been, the project has come to an end. These 3 studies have come to an end, and this evening's forum has come to an end. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to hand over back to Nicole to close us out.
In terms of economic empowerment, our aim with this report was to provide a comprehensive and evidence-based analysis of the issue at hand and to present recommendations that can lead to meaningful and sustainable change through transformative policies. We hope that this report will serve as a valuable resource for policymakers, business leaders, and all those who are committed to closing the gender pay gap and promoting gender equality in Jamaica. On behalf of the entire team, I would like to extend our gratitude to the EU for their financial support and confidence in us to deliver robust, evidence-informed research. Thanks to the panelists, Dr. Dixon Hamill, and to Mr. Blake for their contributions, which facilitated a rich discussion. And thank you, Dr. Thorburn, for moderating this forum. Thanks to you, our virtual audience, for joining and being a part of the discussion. The report is available on our website, capricaribbean.org. Our next event is coming soon in March 2023. We will launch a study on growthless jobs. Look out for the exact date and other details on our socials. Do have a great evening.